Hello, I'm Oliver Pickard, and welcome to beautiful Limousin, France. Now, if you're anything like me, when I'm online, I'm often in search of stuff that's lesser known, that's overlooked, an automotive El Dorado, the lost cars that are great and just less appreciated. Something that's historically significant, fast, beautiful and wonderful handling that for some reason the world has just forgotten about. Well, what if I was to tell you that there are car companies like that? Not just a single car, not just a model of car, but whole companies that are massively important in the history of the automobile. They've just been lost, that people just don't talk about anymore and people just have no education about. Well, in this video, I'm not going to just talk about one of those companies, I'm going to talk about 5. And you may ask yourself, how is it possible that a car company can just disappear? How is it possible that people can just forget a car company exists? Well, let's take, for example, Saab and Pontiac. Saab and Pontiac went out of business not that long ago. But if you were a young automotive enthusiast today reading car magazines, you're not going to come across very many references to Saab or to Pontiac. And so unless you're reading Jalopnik, you're not, or you have a Saab dad, you're not going to know much about Saabs, and you're not going to know much about Pontiacs because their place in the market has just been taken up by the companies that were around them when the companies shut down. So without further ado, let's get stuck into some of the most interesting car companies that no one's ever heard of. The first car on this list, or the first car company on this list, is Chenard-Walcker, spelt Chenard et Walker if you're Googling it. And they were created in 1900 by Ernest Chenard, a bicycle maker, and Henri Walker, who was a mining engineer. And they made your usual early motor cars, stuff with 3 wheels and a tiller and all that, and a constant loss oil system and all that kind of thing. And then the First World War broke out. And when the First World War broke out, Chenard-Walcker became a manufacturer of Hispano-Suiza aircraft engines. Now, other than Rolls-Royce, Hispano-Suiza were the aircraft engine manufacturer on this planet. They built the most advanced aircraft engines the world had known. They were overhead cam, they used exotic materials, precision engineering. They were incredible pieces of engineering. They were incredible pieces of kit. And they were just fantastic. So every Chenard-Walcker engineer working at Chenard-Walcker went from making just your average run-of-the-mill, early 1900s cars to making some of the most advanced space age, for the time, engineering that man had ever seen. They were right on the cutting edge of technology. And then, in 1922, sadly, Ernest Chenard passed away. And his son, Lucien, took up the reins. Now, fortunately for Lucien, it wasn't much of a burden to bear because Chenard-Walcker had been working on a racing car. It was overhead valve and 3 litres. And the very clever engineer that developed the car, Henri Tout, actually invented power braking. Yes, like on a modern car, power brakes like that. But they only worked on the rear wheels. And the reason for this is because cars of that era didn't have, racing cars anyway, didn't have front brakes. Because when you would turn into a corner, if your car had front brakes, it would pull one cable tight on the front wheels. That wheel would lock up, dig into the ground, and flip the car and kill you. So for safety's sake, they removed the front brakes. It sounds a bit ironic, but they removed front brakes for safety. However, Chenard-Walcker was given an incredible opportunity because there was a brand new race about to start. And this little tiny upstart race was called the 24 Hours of Le Mans. And Chenard-Walcker took their racing car with their drivers René Léonard and André Langoche, and they came second and first. So they got a 1-2 at the first ever Le Mans in history. They quickly capitalised on this by creating a road car called the 1012. Because, of course, you came first and second at Le Mans, so of course you're going to create a road car based on your Le Mans car. It was a small capacity. It is a 2 litre rather than a 3 litre like the Le Mans winning racing car was, but still. Now, of course, once you win Le Mans, you can't stop there. And my goodness, did Chenard-Walcker have a follow-up. In 1925, they brought out the Chenard-Walcker tanks. These took strong inspiration from the Bugatti tanks of 1923, which were massively ahead of their time because they were like all aerodynamic bodied and stuff. But the Bugatti tanks didn't really work. Yes, they had front brakes. That was cool. They were hydraulic. They didn't really work. And the car was far too short, and it was unstable, and it was an absolute death trap. It was a very good idea in theory, but not so good in practice. But the Chenard-Walcker tanks were incredible. They took Bugatti-style tank bodywork, an 1100cc voiturette engine, and a little lightweight chassis, and a tiny little supercharger. And they went on to win their class at Le Mans, then at the 24 Hours of Spa, and then the Georges Bouillot Cup. But at the Georges Bouillot Cup, they didn't just win first place. Oh no. In true Chenard-Walcker style, they got first, second, and third. And it was the fourth time that Chenard-Walcker had won the Georges Bouillot Cup. And then they went on to the San Sebastian Grand Prix and won first and second place, beating a 7-litre supercharged Mercedes, proving that lightweight aerodynamic bodywork and good handling were vital for your little racing car and setting the stage for what lightweight voiturettes and what lightweight racing cars needed to be in the future. The next company on this list is a French company started by an American, Benjamin B. Hotchkiss, who created the Hotchkiss Company. And the Hotchkiss Company made bloody big cannons. And that is shown on the head badge of the cars that are cross cannons. That's the symbol of the Hotchkiss Car Company. And they didn't make their first car until 1903. And they didn't really get into their groove until 1929. When Hotchkiss used their first 6-cylinder car, the AM80. Now then, the AM80 wasn't massively revolutionary, but it was really, really good because the AM80 6-cylinder engine was strong, it was reliable, and it made really good torque. And then at the back, Hotchkiss's suspension system, which used links going forward and then diagonal links going to the centre pumpkin. This is a design that is still used today in some Formula Drift cars and also in some drag racing cars. The Hotchkiss system really, really worked. And Hotchkiss took their car to the Monte Carlo Rally, which it won in 1932, 1933, 1934, 1939, 1949 and 1950. Hotchkiss won 6 times. Even more incredible than that, the car that won the Monte Carlo Rally in 1950 wasn't even a factory-backed car. It was a privateer-entered car. Yes, it was a car that some dude had built in his garage, and it wasn't even a new Hotchkiss. It was a pre-war Hotchkiss. Can you imagine that today? Someone turning up in a near 20-year-old car, entering it into the toughest racing event on the planet, and winning. It was nuts. It was the toughest, most prestigious rally on the planet, and this privateer just turns up with a car that is built in the garage and just smashes everybody. How awesome is that? So what happened to Hotchkiss? How can you win the Monte Carlo Rally 6 times and then just disappear? Well, post-Second World War, France was not very friendly to luxury car makers. Luxury cars require a lot of materials to make, and the materials were all being rationed by the French government and used for things that were more important than cars for rich people. So Hotchkiss tried to combat this by creating a 4-cylinder version of its car, but they sold, but just not enough for Hotchkiss to be able to afford to make a new car. They were then taken over by another company and ended up making Jeeps until 1966, when the company was dismantled and partly nationalised. But it's not a sad story, because Hotchkisses are still massively prized by the vintage rally community. They are strong, incredibly well built and incredibly stout vehicles that proved their worth back in the day, and they are still doing that now. The next car on this list is a car company that I'm massively fond of, and if you've seen my Retromobile videos, you will have seen me poring over these cars. But if you haven't seen those videos, don't worry, there'll be a link at the end of this. I am of course talking about Amilcar, created in 1921 by Joseph Lamy and Amilcar. Now then, they pulled their last names together and created Amilcar. They created lightweight but incredibly high quality racing cars and sports cars that were not lesser because they had small engines. They could compete with much bigger, much more powerful vehicles because they had fantastic handling. And they produced their own engines and all their own switches and all their own tiny catches, and every single little tiny screw was made by Amilcar. They're incredible vehicles. If you ever get a chance to see one, the quality is astounding, even by today's standards. And in 1923, they figured out how to do something that no one had ever done before and revolutionized racing forever. And that was figuring out how to make front brakes work on a racing car. You see, Bugatti in 1923 was racing its tanks with their terrible handling and their hydraulic front drum brakes. That's how Bugatti got around not being able to use cable drums on the fronts of his racing cars. But the hydraulic drums, the brake fluid wasn't good, and the seals weren't good, and they were massively unreliable, and there was no telling if you were going to push the brake pedal and it was just going to pour brake fluid through the seals and into the drums, and then you've got, no brakes. They weren't good. But this little tiny car company called Amilcar was driving around in little racing cars with cable brakes that actually worked, and they were taking on and beating much bigger opponents. And in December of 1923 at the Brussels Motor Show, they showed their production-ready cars. Everyone else doesn't have front brakes, and Amilcar's there with going, check this out, guys. This is a racing car you can buy and take to a track day, and it has brakes. It was a revolution. It meant that Amilcar could fly past everyone else in their giant stonking vehicles, and when everybody started braking, Amilcar could keep accelerating right into the corner and then slide it through. If you want evidence of how revolutionary this technology was, you just have to look at the Lyon Grand Prix on August 3rd of 1924. Because Bugatti didn't show up with his tanks. Bugatti showed up with a new car, a Type 34, and they were completely untested. But they were much more conventional looking. They looked much more like an Amilcar. And they had conventional cable brakes at the rear and cable brakes at the front. And they went round corners so fast that they ripped the tyres off the rims. All the Bugattis crashed and none of them finished the Grand Prix. Cars had gotten so fast at going round corners, the tyres couldn't keep up. And all of this is because of a tiny little car company. Unfortunately, Amilcar is often remembered as the poor man's Bugatti because they created a car that was in a lower tax bracket. It just had a smaller engine. But it wasn't a lesser quality thing. And it shouldn't be remembered as a lesser thing because they were equally as great, equally as incredible. And they deserve an equally important part in automotive history. And you can buy an Amilcar today for a tenth of the price of a Bugatti, which is kind of awesome. So, what happened to Amilcar? Well, mass production happened, unfortunately, because Citroën started making cars that you could just literally walk into a dealership, hand a person a stack of money, and drive out a car. You didn't have to order it and then wait for it to be hand-built. And Amilcar's quality was above all things. But that meant waiting times, and not everybody was willing to wait for a car that wasn't a luxury product. And unfortunately, the Amilcar name didn't survive the Second World War. The next company on our list is a British company, and it's a post-war company. But the story starts much earlier than that, because the story of Allard is the story of Sidney Herbert Allard. Sidney Herbert Allard was born in 1910, and his family owned a Ford garage. And young Sidney wanted to go racing, so he bought a Morgan three-wheeler, and he won his first race at Brooklands, beating a bunch of Austin 7s. And that was his first taste of victory. And Sidney then fell in love with the idea of trials. Now, vehicle trials, automobile trials at the time, were basically a mix between rallies and like endurance and stage events. They were this very loose interpretation of basically crazy off-road events in cars. And he wanted to do it in his Morgan. Unfortunately, Morgans suck at going off-road because they've only got one back wheel, so all your power's just, you're just going to do a lot of spinning of tyres. So Sidney took his Morgan into his workshop and gave it 2 back wheels and created a 4-wheel Morgan three-wheeler. Now then, he loved driving off-road, and he was very, very good at it. And over time, he created a number of racing cars, culminating in him shoving a flathead Ford V8 engine into a Bugatti body to create a rally car. What a badass. And then his brother-in-law wanted one. So they both took a V12 Lincoln flathead and put that in a similar body. They also cut the front axle and gave it a pivot to create a swing axle front axle, giving it independent front suspension. And Sidney Allard became the scourge of hill climbs and rallies all over Britain. He even tried to drive up Ben Nevis, which, if you don't know, is the biggest mountain in Britain. That's no tall order. I've been up Ben Nevis. It's like that. And actually, he didn't manage it, and he rolled the car, and the car was damaged, but he was fine. And then the Second World War broke out. And Sidney did the right thing and went to work for the family business, servicing Ford trucks for the military. But that put him in an incredibly fortuitous circumstance when the war ended, because he found himself surrounded by army surplus V8 bits. So he started building his own cars. No longer would these be specials. No longer would these be a hodgepodge of parts from here and parts from there and whatever you can get your hands on. No, these would be Sidney Allard from beginning to end. And in 1950, Allard took his J2 to Le Mans and raced it. In fact, he was one of the racing drivers who raced it. And they got 3rd, which is a good result, but it's an incredible result considering the fact that with 10 hours to go, they broke the gearbox. And so they shoved it in top gear and they raced for the last 10 hours of Le Mans with a gearbox shoved in top. They took on the best cars in the world at one of the hardest races in the world, and this little car made in a shed beat some of the greatest supercars on the planet at the time. And it did it with a broken gearbox. And that pretty much cemented Allard as something to reckon with. But in 1952, they took it one step further, and Sidney Allard took a P1, driving it himself to the Monte Carlo Rally, which he proceeded to win. And not only did he win, but the person who came in second was a little-known racing driver called Sterling Moss. Never heard of that bloke. That's how good and how much of a badass Sidney Allard was. And his cars were definitely badass. In fact, fans of his cars were, among many others, a young Mr. Carroll Shelby, who was a racing driver for Aston Martin, who had Le Mans experience of his own, and a Mr. Zora Arcus Duntov, who you may know as the guy who designed the Corvette. And they both owned Allard. They both owned Allards in the early 50s. Like, without Allard, there is no American sports car. Sidney Allard invented putting a V8 engine in a sports car and making it go very, very fast everywhere. And the man was an absolute badass. So why isn't Allard a household name? Why aren't they big like Cobra or like Corvette? Well, to put it simply, running a car company in England is difficult, and running a sports car company in England is financial suicide. And in 1957, the company ran out of money and had to shut down, unfortunately. But that wasn't the end of Sidney, because Sidney went on to produce Europe's first ever dragster and become the chairman of the British Drag Racing Foundation, Society, whatever. Right, on to our final car, and it's our oldest by far, and it's also our only Italian. Now, if you study early Italian automotive history, the name Matteo Cirano will come up quite often, because Matteo Cirano in 1904 created a car company called Itala, and in 1905 they drove their first racing car out of their workshop, and it was a 14.8 litre 5-cylinder behemoth of a thing. It was a fire-spitting, wood-spoked, like, demon of a car, and it won the Coppa Florio and the year after the Targa Florio. These were like really tough road races. I say road races, there weren't no paved roads, so there were gravel roads, no brakes, public roads, people crossing roads, like roads not shut down, that kind of thing, racing around donkeys. People died. They were super dangerous, and to win it, it was more important that you had a tough car that could finish it than having a fast car. But Itala managed to produce both, and winning these two races cemented them as a company that could produce a car that wouldn't shake apart after the first 5 seconds. Which in the early, in the 1910s, cars sucked. I mean, cars were this thing that you drive 20 metres down a road, it breaks down, and then you fix it, and then you drive another 20 metres down the road and it breaks down again. They were a folly for rich people. They weren't really a viable transport. And that was a problem, because the world had a giant pollution problem, and it was called horses, because every city in the developed world was full of horses. Every single service vehicle was horses, and that's a problem, because police cars had a mind of their own. That's an issue, and a lot of people got run over and killed and trampled by a lot, big coaches and stuff. But also, horses poo a lot, and then when it rains, it all runs into the rivers, and people get ill, and it's a reason why you see like old trousers in the 1910s. 19, and they're all short. If you look at like 1900 trousers, you've got like a lot of sock and then trouser, and it all looks like people bought their trousers and then grew a bit. The reason for that, obviously, is because the roads were full of poo, which sucks. And there were people who believed that the automobile could be a viable alternative to the horse, but it had to be proven. And so how are you going to prove that? Well, a few people designed the toughest challenge and the hardest race that had been created to date. And that was to drive, it was a race, not just to drive, it was a race from Pekin, which is now Beijing, to Paris. And in 1907, Count Scipione Borghese drove his Itala in the Pekin to Paris. It was an economy model though. It was a 7.443 litre. But it was incredibly reliable, and it was fast. In fact, he won. He won the hardest race on the planet. But not only did he win the hardest race on the planet, he won it by 3 weeks. To put that into perspective, that's the same amount of time in those days it took to cross the Atlantic by boat. So by the time second place rolled through the finish line, Count Scipione Borghese could have actually been in New York. Like, that's madness. But it cemented that cars could be viable. It cemented that cars were reliable, that cars could cross mountains, that cars were actually something that could replace horses. And at the figurehead of all of that was the name Itala. And it cemented them into automotive history forever. If you've liked this video, please make sure that you support it, because there are many people out there who believe that pre-war cars aren't worth bothering about with YouTube videos. That's why there's not another video like this. No one has done this video before, ever. And the reason is, I've checked all over YouTube, and the reason is because people don't think pre-war cars are worth bothering with. People don't think you care about pre-war cars, so they don't think it's worth making this video. They don't think driving pre-war cars in videos is worth it. They don't think it's worth bothering with. I want to prove those people wrong, but I also love this subject. I also love pre-war cars, and I love history, and I love telling these stories, because if nobody... like, I didn't know as a young guy about this stuff until I found out about it, because I had no education in it. And I adore this subject. And so I always think, if I make videos that I love making, then you'll love watching them. So please, let's help me to prove that pre-war cars are worth it. Pre-war cars are worth making videos about, and that automotive history is really worth telling. Thank you all for watching. Please be awesome to each other, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye bye.